What's up, Miami? This is Paul Schulz with WVUM Coral Gables. Today we present to you the newest talk show here at the University of Miami, Talking Taboo. Today I'm accompanied by two very special people.
Hey guys, it's Portia B.
And it's me, Tej.
And today we're going to talk some controversies, and our very first show is going to be about sexuality.
We have a very special guest with us today, Paul.
Today we have Professor Porter from the University of Miami. She teaches Intro to Women and Gender Studies as well as LGBTQ Studies.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So we're going to start off with the key question, what is sexuality?
Ooh.
What do you guys think?
Sexuality.
You can go Webster, Oxford Dictionary, or you can go Portia B.
Portia B. All right. Well, personally, in my experience, I feel like sexuality is... It's hard to define in the sense that it's nothing, but it's everything. And I think it's just something that shapes the way we live our lives. And I don't know. I think each person chooses how they think about it and with how they were raised. What about you?
Well, what if you look at sexuality just from the most basic concept, not trying to get too complicated with it, but just like the expression of sexual desires, no matter what they may be and however they may be. I think that's the most simple and like easy way to look at it so you don't, get too construed in your head.
So, Portia and Tej, what do you guys specifically identify as, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, I think personally it's hard as a girl in general to talk about sexuality and to really understand what it is, because from the moment you're a girl, you're just constantly objectified and constantly people are telling you what you should think about sexuality, what you should be, how you should act,
Snaps to that,
what's beautiful and everything. And it just was so weird for me because I always thought coming to college that thought blonde men with blue eyes was so beautiful, and that was and then I came to UM. I'm from Connecticut. Small town in Connecticut, very, very majority white. And I came here, there's so many other cultures, and I was like, what's going on? Like,
if they're not foreign, they're boring.
Exactly. And I realized it's because my parents had only bought me, like, blonde Ken dolls. Not any sort of thing that they meant to do or whatever, but that's just what we played with, because those are the kinds of people I went to school with. And then I never even thought, hey, maybe I want to go up and give my number to someone who's a different race. Like, and it was a whole new thing. It totally flipped me around. So
now, for the most part, I feel like women in general are a lot more fluid than men. And I think maybe that stems from the fact that men have to be hypermasculine all the time, and not conforming to this hypermasculinity almost prevents them from ever really questioning their sexuality, because, like, as a man, I think you're born, and from that day you're born, you're almost forced to like women. And if you don't, then you're shunned. But why do you think it's different with girls? Why do you think girls have that ability to almost like experiment and are expected to experiment? Maybe we can get a professional opinion from Dr. Porter.
Well, there are several ways we could approach that kind of question. Certainly, boys and men are really in danger if they stray outside this box of masculinity and acceptable masculine behaviors. So, in fact, our culture and society is very sexist toward men in that regard, in that they're expected to adhere to these really narrow ideas of what it means to be a man, including who they have sex with. And who they never should even ever have a thought about having sex with. So for women, there is a lot more fluidity, and that's backed up in research studies about sexual desire. So that's pretty well established. But in terms of societal acceptance, it may be in part that women are so sexualized. They're made into sexual objects. So they're often sort of imagined to be hypersexual or fantasized to be hypersexual in the popular culture as well as in high art forms, where there's just a great deal of emphasis on women's sexuality. So that doesn't mean, though, at the same time that women don't also get some chances and opportunities to explore their sexuality that men might not, by the very fact that their sexuality is objectified. So we can see it in the hookup culture too, and some of the research that's coming out about college hookup scene,
especially in college. Yes.
Yeah, where like two girls at a frat party who are sitting on a couch making out. Yes, they're being objectified in that room, and in a way, their sexuality is being pornographized. But on the other hand, as some researchers are finding, this may give women an opportunity to express or explore their sexuality. So, we don't have to imagine it's all bad or all good. There can be elements of both in the culture.
And do you think this inclination for girls to experiment in social settings such as frat parties, do you think it comes from a desire to appeal to men? Because if you do find yourself making out with a girl, maybe it's to show off or to flaunt what you can do.
Sure, and to really meet the social expectations of what it means to be sexy and hot as a woman in this society. Now, granted, it's only certain women who are encouraged to do that, right? So women who fit into certain kind of racial ideas and certain kinds of ideas of beauty are the only ones who'd be getting any kind of privilege there. And so certain women are able to make what's sometimes called a patriarchal bargain, where they may get certain power and privilege by pleasing, powerful men or, ideas that are held within an industry that makes a lot of money, for example. So there are lots of female celebrities who make patriarchal bargains, and those they can gain certain advantages from that, and later on they may be able to twist that and be outspoken feminists if they get enough power. But for women who aren't able to navigate these patriarchal bargains and really get a lot of power, they may be relatively silenced. So I was just watching part of an interview that Uma Thurman is given, the actress, about Harvey Weinstein. And her face is just incredible because she says she can't say anything right now because she's too angry about whatever happened between she and Harvey Weinstein. So even someone as powerful and sort of iconically sort of white and beautiful, this movie star is still feeling like she can't quite, voice her own feelings. So there's, I think that it's certainly true that women can get some kind of power from being sexy in ways that, heterosexual men in power can but there are a lot of people who are excluded from that too.
Well, I've always sort of felt a strangeness inside when I go to a club with my friends, and the promoter says, send pictures of you and your friends, and and then this happens all the time. So you go through your Instagram, you try to find the best picture where you look the skinniest and you look super good, and you send it over to him. He says, okay, good, come, or
I love oppression.
or God forbid he says otherwise, or he says, oh great, you guys can come on the yacht next weekend. And so part of me feels, oh, awesome, we get to experience Miami and do all these fun things because, my friends and I, but then there's part of me is some girls aren't able to do this at all. So, and boys aren't able to do this. And so, do I want to take advantage of being objectified by these men, or do I want to, in a way, sacrifice the fun times I could be having to have a little bit more pride in not being, going along with such sexism? But
and I don't want to speak for women, but I do feel like a lot of women do acknowledge when they get perks from being sexualized, for example. And I don't know, it might come off as empowering in the sense that if you know that you can get something out of the way you look, maybe women are almost putting themselves above men because they don't do it mindlessly, but rather they do it on purpose because they know that they can get what they want from it.
But Portia, why do you still continue to send the photos if you have these internal conversations with yourself? And are these just internal conversations, or do you sit down with a group of friends and be like, why are we doing this? Should we not do this maybe?
No, I think it's clear to everyone in the situation that it's not fully appropriate and it's not something that we're proud to go along with. But I think what I tell my mom, when my parents, when we talk about these kinds of stuff, I say, listen, I'm going to be objectified no matter what. If I try to get into the club without a promoter, without having a table, it's going to happen. I may as well take advantage of it. I may as well get the invites and go to behind the DJ booth, whatever it may be. It's already going to happen to me. Guys are already going to catcall. It's already going to be that sort of environment. So you may as well take the step up and just do it. I mean, it's sad, but it's what everyone does.
Don't you feel as though maybe getting the perks is a benefit, but at the end of the day, should you stand for female equality, wouldn't you rather not accept those offers and know that you're standing for something much greater, even though you standing up for that isn't necessarily getting rid of inequality right away?
I mean, that's the same thing as, am I not going to have air conditioning in my house because I don't want to hurt the environment? You know what I mean? You all have to every day make these sort of choices on, are you going to be the one that stands up to this big problem that everyone else is going with? And I'm not happy to say it, but in my life, I have just gone, with the girls and done what they do and done what we've all done together. And it's not, it's not something I'm proud of, but but then the next day we're like, that was great. We had a great time. You know what I mean? And, there's always stories of course, like uncomfortable situations with the promoters and men and stuff, but it's honestly, it's Miami in a lot of ways. Like, I've been out in New York City before and had a girl promoter. Okay, so that's a whole other story, and then that's just interesting because her job is to get pretty girls to come to her table, so
make them feel comfortable as a woman.
Well, so she herself is almost objectifying because she doesn't want to be known as the promoter who, since she's a girl, she doesn't care if the girls are hot or not. She'll bring less attractive girls or whatever. So she is sort of going in with it even more in a sense, but it made me feel comfortable that she was a girl. So it's just, the whole club scene is so strange, I think, especially in Miami, because it's so just about what you look like. You could be totally fake, it doesn't matter, and it's just, which is another thing about beauty. We wanted to talk a little bit about beauty today, and I think this wraps very nicely into that, is what is beautiful. In New York, you try to look as beautiful as you can without it seeming like you're trying, You're not supposed to have the fake eyelashes,
Understated.
the big boot. Yes, you're supposed to look like you just got out of bed and you're that beautiful.
More natural look.
In Miami, everything can be bought, and it doesn't matter, you are beautiful.
Well, so for the most part, and Dr. Porter, I feel like maybe you could piggyback off of this, but I feel like beauty is conditioned. We have countries in Africa, Nigeria specifically, where the bigger a woman is, the more healthy she seems, and thus the more attractive to the male gaze she would be. So for the most part, do you think that lust and appeal is basically constructed from a young age, or are we born with like an inherent liking of the opposite sex or same sex, and then that's altered as we grow up?
The only universal ideal of attractiveness that anthropologists have found is clear skin. Everything else is completely variant, right? So, ideas about what ideal size is. So even more than Nigeria, Mauritania has an ideal for a woman to be over 200 pounds to be attractive, very hard for her to get married.
Right.
Beneath that, there's actually an epidemic of women using certain kinds of drugs, including really strong antihistamines in Sudan, in East Africa, because and cortisone-based drugs, which are kind of dangerous, to get that sort of really chubby, round moon face that people who take cortisone drugs here in the U.S. complain about. That they say, I have this, I look all, kind of thick and chubby, but that's the ideal in Sudan. So certainly all of this is conditioned, as you said, and it's also always about who has power in society to be able to say what's beautiful. So anthropologists have also shown that a liking for larger, thick bodies, women and men, tends to happen in societies where there's relative resource scarcity, where there's not as much access to calories because it's a status thing.
So appeal can basically range from, I guess, like changes in perspective, because in that case, someone who is bigger and there is a scarcity of resources, then the idea would be you can almost associate that person to wealth and health, and thus that in itself is attractive. But when we talk about appeal and sexual appeal, does that range from country to country? Are there certain fetishes in certain countries that are maybe very drastic from the ones we have in the U.S.?
Yeah, and we should probably start by saying a lot of our fetishes are pretty drastic. So, there's been a lot of attention here about sexuality and women's sexuality in parts of the world where they do some sort of genital surgery, like removal of parts of the external genitalia. But it's important to say that in the U.S. right now, we're also seeing that epidemic, and it's because of the dominant issue, kind of images we see in heterosexual pornography, where a lot of pornographic actresses are forced to have part of their labia cut off for aesthetical reasons. So we have our own extremes internally. It's just that we tend to normalize them. So we're seeing a lot of girls, even who are teenagers in the U.S., who are asking for and opting to get this kind of surgery, even though that would cut down on sexual sensation and cause other problems during childbirth. So, certainly there's a range of, sort of ideals that are fetishized, beauty ideals that are fetishized. But usually a fetish itself is some sort of indication about power and ideals, like the fetishization of back in China when foot binding was like a thing. The little sock and shoe of a woman with a bound foot was a sexual fetish. So women had to lock those up behind closed doors because they would get stolen at night, right? So they usually are an indicator that there's some sort of power dynamic within the society that needs to be explored.
So if that's the case, if most fetishes are created, say, by someone who's much more powerful socially, how can you say, or how can you really tell whether someone's sexuality, heterosexual or homosexual, is created or innate? So for the most part, if someone is gay, where would they construct that sexuality from, or where would that inclination come from?
Well, I guess the first question I would ask you is this person identifying with a certain gender category?
Say gay males, a gay boy, how would he necessarily construct, or at least why would he want to? Because that's a typical argument that homosexuality is a choice. But in the first place, why would he want to make that life for him, make that life decision? And at the same time, how does that sexuality come about?
That's a very complex process, and we know relatively little about it, although there are certainly people who are experts who've devoted a lot of time and research to this question. We do know more about men's sexuality than women's. So the few possible genetic or biological indicators for homosexuality are not very consistent, but when they are consistent, it tends to be with men and not with women. So a lot of times lesbian identifying women were just left out of the studies because the scientists were having such a hard time of sort of pinning down and being able to quantify these statistics about from whence their sexuality came. So another thing to think about here is that in the research we have, where a kind of a device that's like a monitor that's actually attached to people's genitals, and they're shown pornographic not like sexually explicit images. Right. What we know is that yes, men who identify as heterosexual tend to be far more aroused by what we would identify as heterosexual explicit, sexual images or pornography, but those same men also did have a level of arousal when they looked at gay porn. And that was largely ignored. So for women, when those same kinds of studies are done where they, try to detect their, genital swelling and whatnot, they find that that women are more reticent to report, to actually say they were aroused, but it looks like they probably were. But also, and that's the case some of the time, but also that women tend to be sexually aroused by report, at least, that they are in a wide range of stimuli. So, even if they claim to be heterosexual in their lives, being sexually aroused by seeing lesbian porn, or being sexually aroused by seeing gay men porn, even being sexually aroused watching animals having sex. Right, so we don't.
That's taboo in itself.
Yeah, right, and that's not at all to say that they're planning to go out and do like bestiality.
Right.
But it is saying that sexual desire is more complicated even than the studies seem to indicate at this point. That just because someone self-reports as heterosexual or homosexual, that only tells, that's just such a small part of the story of human sexuality.
Fluidity. In total.
Yeah.
So I actually want to quiz you guys on some sexualities that I found on the internet. So feel free to buzz in, even though we don't have a buzzer. And so we'll start with the first one. Can anyone tell me what polysexual is?
Is that
Give it a shot.
Is that when, poly means many, so are we talking about just being attracted to many different genders?
Yeah. Oh, perfect. 5 points for Portia. Polysexuals are attracted to more than one gender identity.
So this might be later on in the quiz, but I'm just curious, how is that different than pansexual?
Okay, that was my next question. So someone who's pansexual, also known as omnisexual, is someone capable of being attracted to people of all gender identities and any biological sex. So specifically, polysexual is someone who I would assume is attracted to males or females. While pansexuals, you can be intersex and you can still be attracted to that person, even though they don't confine to being male or female.
So are these definitions based in orientation of sex or gender? Like,
so these specifically, so for example, pansexual, the definition itself is all-inclusive. So if you're biologically male or female, a pansexual can be attracted to you. And if you identify as male or female, someone who's pansexual can also be attracted to you.
interesting.
Which is interesting. I don't know if you guys want to differentiate the difference between sex and
I
gender.
always thought that pansexual sort of meant you were attracted to someone's like personality more than like anything, but I don't really know. Like that's what I feel like in high school we sort of would talk about. Like, oh, he's pansexual. Like he's like attracted to the personality.
And I think personality is definitely included in that, because at the end of the day, if you were to say a pansexual is attracted to both genders, you would say that's bisexual.
But now I'm thinking that that's such like a naive, like high school
definition
typical
of it, right.
straight teenager thing. Oh, it's because she thinks he's funny, you know what I mean, or whatever.
Right.
And it's not much like no, you can be sexually attracted to like whoever, whenever, whatever, you know. And so
it's just not definitive of that person's gender or sex.
And it's not about the two genders, right? We're looking at this in more of like a gender spectrum.
Right. Mm-hmm. So if this person's intersex,
Yeah.
a pansexual individual can in fact be attracted to that.
And maybe this is a good question for you, Professor. What other genders are there on the gender spectrum other than male and female? Because intersex would be not a gender, it would be a sex, right?
I mean, you're raising a really important issue here. That in the intro classes, I have this saying. Paul knows it, right? That sex is between your legs, gender is between your ears, and sexuality is between the sheets, right? And that seems like really neat and tidy, right? So we can know the difference, right?
Yeah, I have that tattooed on my thigh now.
Right. So we can say, oh well, sex is just your biology, and that's really simple, right, to define, except it's really not. And then there's gender, which is between your ears, and then it's how society is how does society train you to think you should behave, and from a very young age, so that you just start to feel like all of these behaviors are natural, like the feminine and masculine are natural. And then sexuality is between the sheets because it's just your sexual desire, except that a lot of people's sexuality is intimately tied to their gender. And vice versa. And that we know from research that when people go through, say, a transgender surgery, sometimes their sexual desires change, after that transition. So it's not nearly so straightforward as we'd perhaps like to imagine.
So, bouncing off Tej, what's the difference between non-binary and intersex? So would non-binary be someone who doesn't affiliate with male or female, and intersex would be biologically speaking?
Yeah, so my understanding is that intersex is a term that's an umbrella term for a variety of forms of genital and internal biological variants that's natural within the human species.
Because I actually was reading a report that came out 2 years ago. There was I don't know if you guys might have heard of this also. There's a small village in southern Dominican Republic where like almost 1 in 90 boys there are born intersex, and what
does that mean specifically?
So they were what I read was they were born where they had female genitalia up until the age around 12 or 13, and then so they had XY chromosomes, but there was some sort of mutation where they wouldn't develop male genitalia until the age of 12 or 13. So they were raised as girls, given female names, but they would never develop breasts or anything like that. It's a really interesting, and here the Spanish word that they would call these kids is, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly at all, is guevedosis. So
we'll go with guevedosis.
So I don't know that is that just one instance of intersex, and there's many different instances. Okay.
Yeah, there are many different forms of intersex, and they seem to be just a very natural part of human sexual diversity and biological diversity. Now, how a culture handles this, I mean, it sounds like in the Dominican Republic, they're kind of anticipating this, right? And that this is something,
it's so ubiquitous in their culture.
Yeah,
many people have this gender, this mutation.
Yeah. Oh, but I would stray away from calling it a mutation, just because it's probably just part of that natural diversity.
Right.
Just like in a way we kind of imagine that genitals are really just two kinds, and there are these cookie cutter genitals, but in reality there's all kinds of diversity there too. That's kind of taboo or not talked about, or talked about in fetishistic kinds of ways, right? So the way that cultures accept or don't accept intersex people is part of what has been sort of looked at by anthropologists in varied communities around the world.
So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to discuss preferences, and we're going to see whether preferences have anything to do with inherent racism, or if we naturally have preferences towards specific races and people.
And really quick, I just want to add that if anyone is listening and you have any sort of topics or cool questions you would like to ask any one of us, the number is 786-309-8861. That's 786-309-8861. All right, guys, keep it locked. We'll be right back.
Your words are like bullets, whizzing past my face. There's danger if I move or if I stay. I reach out my hands, and you take out your sword. Baby, is this love or is this war? How did I get here when my life's a ticking time bomb? And you wouldn't save me, no, you're setting off like 3, 2, 1. Soldiers, gather your guns, and this town won't be home when you're done. I won't fall down when you push me this time. I'll be screaming loud, so hear my battle cry. Oh, hear my battle cry. I remember your sweet kiss, love was worth fighting for, but I don't see that anymore. I used to wear camouflage to dodge all the pain, but today I'm marching forward and I won't walk away. How did I get here when my life's a ticking time bomb? Better get ready for the battle to be won. Soldiers, gather your guns, and this town won't be home when you're done. I won't fall down when you push me this time. I'll be screaming loud, so hear my battle cry. Oh, hear my battle cry. Won't wave my white flag, won't walk away. I will face the flames and be brave. And when I seize the day, don't call my name. Not gonna stay. Soldiers, gather your guns, and this town won't be home when you're done. I won't fall down when you push me this time. I'll be screaming loud, so hear my battle. Soldiers, gather your guns, and this town won't be home when you're done. I won't fall down when you push me this time. I'll be screaming loud, so hear my battle cry.
Hello. We are back with Talking Taboo, WVUM, Coral Gables, 90.5. So before we left off, we were talking about sexuality, what sexuality is, the different types of sexuality, and now we're going to go into preferences. So I know preferences is a very taboo topic because people say that they are free to have what their preferences are. However, a lot of people argue that having a preference is merely a form of racism because you're not giving any other marginalized group an opportunity to be appealing, and that simply comes from where you grow up, what you're exposed to. Any thoughts?
I think I've had experience with some friends who have been attracted to that aren't racist, but they have parents that maybe are, for lack of a more appropriate word, old-fashioned, or if we could just, let's just be straight out with them, they're a little bit racist.
From a different time.
Or whatever, from a different world, but...
Prehistoric.
Yeah, something like that. And honestly, those friends that I have are attracted to the races that their parents don't like. And it's such an interesting thing, because then they have the secret, oh, they're a different religion, we can't be dating, because, God forbid they find out, and whatever. And I think it's interesting to think of that idea of wanting what you can't have, or wanting what is taboo in your family.
The forbidden fruit.
Yeah.
It's I think it's a really common thing. And I think preferences aren't innately racist, even though you may have a preference towards a certain race. So, for me personally, I'm an Indian American. Not Native American, but my family's from India, and I grew up in America. And I've always been attracted to other Indian Americans or white people, and that's because I think I most culturally identify with those groups. Those are the groups I grew up around, and I think it's not that I'm
intentionally want to,
and it's not that I'm only attracted to those groups. I think it just. Those are the groups I most identify with, and you tend to be attracted to the people you identify with. And maybe it might be a form of benign racism that I'm not expanding my
horizons,
my inner circles to people outside of that group. But I don't think should be considered racist. But maybe I'm not using the term racist right here. Maybe I'm not.
I think in the gay community specifically, it is a really large issue. Specifically because a lot of gay men have a preference.
Paul, I'm going to call you out really quick. So, we first met, I pulled up, I have a best friend named Mike, and he's gay, and I pulled him up and said, Paul, you would be so good together, your personalities would literally be perfect together. And you go, oh, I don't like to be with guys that look too much like me. I said, what? I said, what? You're like, yeah, he's too much like me.
I think and maybe you're not calling me out. Maybe you're making me look really diverse. But at the end of the day, I feel like in the gay community, there's this inclination for example, black men not to be seen as appealing. And there's apps like Grindr and Tinder where white men or men that aren't black will go out of their way to make black gay men feel lesser than them. And I think that has to do with what the media portrays as beautiful.
I never knew that.
Specifically because in the gay community, I think the standard is a white male who is ripped, buff, attractive, with blonde hair, blue eyes,
and has money.
Money.
That's very
class too.
I think class is really important, and from what I read about the gay community, I think it's really it's often forgotten that class is so. Just integral to it, like people when they
you mean how much money you have, or how classy you are?
No, well, both really, but I think it all comes down to money. I
know some pretty rich people without any class. I could take some lessons in that.
Yes, my mother. But as I was saying, I think for the most part, it really depends on the media, because I feel like when coming into college, my preferences, and I admit I have preferences, I think they definitely widened out because I was able to come into contact with gay men from all over the world. Mm-hmm. And so my initial perspective of just the white man being beautiful, I think has shifted a lot more since coming into college.
Oh, that's exactly what I just said earlier.
Well, I think I had an epiphany, and I think I just matured here on air, so thank you, Portia.
No, you're totally welcome, but I totally think it goes back to the exact same thing that you were just saying, right. The media, and I think the media has so much to do with also our genders, and also how we feel about what we should be as a woman, what we should be as a man, and I think we're getting a little bit off topic, but I think that that's what is destroying our environment. I think that, men's idea of needing to be masculine, needing to make money, needing to be, dog-eat-dog world has really brought America specifically into this spot where we don't care if the environment is at stake. We don't care if we're going to pollute the earth or whatever it may be, but we are, men are supposed to make money and don't worry about anything else. You worry about your small circle of your family, and that is it, and that is who a man is. And I think that that's really why it's so hard for politicians and people to wake up and say, maybe the environment is more important than us making the most money.
I think at the end of the day, even though people hate to admit that they might have racist inclinations, I think it's important to acknowledge that maybe your mentality is potentially racist. And although you wouldn't go out of your way to be maleficent towards other people, I think it is important to acknowledge that you might not be exposed to cultures or races or ethnicities that are foreign to your own, and that in itself might make you racist because you will have these preconceived notions about those races. And because you aren't exposed to them, maybe you might see them in a light that isn't attractive to you because it's not normal to you.
And if I could just jump in and say that it would be a good idea to open up the definition of racism itself.
Right.
Too often we kind of think a racist is like someone who was carrying a tiki torch, or has a white sheet, or is part of an official sort of one of those alt-right groups. But racism is so foundational to our culture and society. So it would be well nigh impossible for our sexual attractions and our ideals of beauty not to emerge from that same racism. So, and we see it across the board. Like what you were saying about the gay community having this problem. I mean, it's the same problem.
There's parallels
in straight
and other communities,
right? Where there's just sort of a certain kind of pinnacle ideal of beauty or handsomeness that reflects really who's been on top of the hierarchy. And also to connect this with looksism. I mean, are we conflating here like racism and looksism, or can we say that there's a difference between being attracted to a certain look and it being specifically about race? I mean, I'm asking you.
Can you differentiate?
I'm not familiar with looksism.
Neither am I.
It's a discrimination based on how physically attractive a person is deemed to be. Right. So if
regardless of race or ethnicity.
Well, the thing is, it often dovetails with ideas about race, right? Like a certain kind of body figure, right? Or white people's never-ending love of being tan, right? But then whiteness still being kind of fetishized as something superior to darker skin. At the same time, we see it happening with women's bodies more and more. We see white women who are celebrities who are given kind of accolades for having certain parts of their body that look like a racial other, but not actually being Black or Latina.
Right.
So we see a lot of that going on. And I'm just really skeptical that this is not really about racism. That's not to say that we go up to people and say, you're a racist, because that's not productive. So then the question is, how do we question or challenge things like something that just seems so natural, like sexual attraction to people, that is often kind of at first sight, without sort of trying to condemn or alienate people.
And I think you can tell that the racism exists in the sense that Pornhub has categories that fetishize certain races. So for example, like Asian porn is specifically I think one of the most watched by white men in the US because
Asian women.
And I think that doesn't necessarily stem back to the idea that they find Asian women beautiful, but rather Asian women are being objectified to be just something of pleasure that's different and foreign that they can tamper with because it's so different.
And there are these specific kind of stereotypes of Asian women,
submissive specifically,
and those same stereotypes are at work in gay circles as well.
Right.
There's a fetishization of Asian men, but Asian men are also put at high risk for HIV because of sexual dynamics. So there's some research about that, about Asian men being sort of considered to have low status in the gay community in terms of attractiveness. But then in sex, as being sort of the passive one or the receiver. And a lot of gay Asian men report in the research really being very aware of their status in the gay community. That continues as well. So I mean, the communities have a lot in common in terms of relationships of power and how sex becomes an expression of relationships of power.
And I think that's a really interesting point about like how different racial groups are treated in the sexual arena, because I was reading another article recently that was talking about how if you look at Asian women, they're often seen as that submissive stereotype, because they of like a patriarchal society that submissiveness would like epitomize what all women should be in that patriarchal view of submissive, and on the opposite end, black men are often sought after because they epitomize that masculinity. So I think that's like a really interesting way to look at it. And I just want to come back to looksism for a second, and I think it goes beyond just sexuality and sex. I think I'm definitely guilty of this, and I'm sure
I think you're going somewhere with this.
I know exactly
Take it
where
away.
you're going.
Take it away. Yeah.
I'm definitely more inclined to be friends with people who look good. I don't know if that's where you guys wanted me to go with this. Go
No,
with this.
yeah.
But like,
Kind of. You took a right turn. Maybe you'll get there soon.
no, I think people often look around and say, I don't know if they have this like actual conversation with themselves, but I think we more and more want to hang out and be around people who look good, and not just because they're easy on the eyes, but I think it's because we have this weird feeling that because they look good in the society we live in, they will be more successful.
Right.
And then it's better to be friends with them.
I can definitely agree. I have looked around in different periods of my life, whether it be college, high school, whatever, and all my friends are pretty. I mean, my friend Veronica's right here in the studio. You guys can't see her because we're doing a radio show, but she's gorgeous. My friends are just so beautiful, and when I meet a beautiful girl, I don't think, oh, I want to be friends with her because she's pretty. You know what I mean? It just seems like
You have that natural attraction to them.
it feels like, oh, maybe we'll be friends. I'm not sure why. I really don't know. But I'm not. But then it's not when I see a less conventionally beautiful person that I think, oh, I would never be friends with them. I just and I do talk to them. I do love people that I think might not be as hot, as beautiful,
Right.
whatever. I think you have a great time. I mean, friends, Paul, I'm friends with you. You know what I'm saying? So.
And even though I am ugly, thanks, Portia, I think we're typically attracted, or we want to almost gravitate towards people that are similar to us. So if you think about it, me, for example, sometimes I have a hard time socializing with people who are shy, because I wouldn't go out of my way to necessarily talk to them, because I assume that because they're shy, they don't want to have a conversation with me.
Or they might not be similar to you in other
Exactly.
ways. Yeah.
So thus I'm attracted to you both, because you guys are so extroverted and outgoing. And so the question is it necessarily bad for people to seek out those who are similar to them? And maybe another question is, maybe that is okay as long as you're conscientious of seeking out people who are different from you.
Interesting. It's
So Portia, maybe you need some ugly friends. Is what it seems like.
That's what I'm there for.
But in terms of sexuality, we're gonna bring it back to sexuality with Dr. Porter. I know you've discussed in some of your lessons that certain countries have certain sexual routines or sexual tendencies that we might feel are very different from ours. Do you have any examples?
Well, there's quite a bit about sex that's regulated by cultures and societies, in terms of what's okay to do, what you would never think of doing, how you would do it, or who you would do it with. There's just tremendous variance along those lines. So, some of the cultural societies that we tend to bring up in the intro classes or in anthropology classes have been in the Highlands area of New Guinea as examples, where boys go through a period where they engage in what we would think of as homosexual sex. We have to be careful about that term because that's our term and our sort of understanding of how sex works.
Because for them, it isn't necessarily homosexual. It's routine. It's
it's a
normal.
ritual.
It's a ritual, right?
And yeah, exactly. So, and then usually these boys, as they grow up, they move on to the next stage after that, where they're married to women. And for most of them, they no longer engage in what we would think of as homosexual sex, but some do. And they tend not to face any kind of repercussions for that if they choose to continue to engage in homosexual sex as well. So one of the risks that we really run when we talk about, other people's cultures is that we may sort of inadvertently make them into others with a capital O, is sort of strange and exotic. Right. But I mean, in talking about this, what we can kind of get from talking about how cultures do sex differently is that we can challenge any idea that it's just normal or it's just within us. that sex is just something humans do because it's sort of innate or instinctual. And that's really unlikely given how much diversity there is. So there are societies where people may only have sex once every few years or a couple times a year in a festival. And then there are societies like ours where we imagine that men are just constantly in a state of needing it, wanting it, trying to get it, and if they're not, something's wrong with them. So we really put a lot of pressure on men in that sense.
And I think you've mentioned before that, I'm not sure where the country is or the group of people, but there's a tendency for a certain group of people to remove their eyelashes, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
It was.
So, in parts of Tahiti as a sexual thing.
And I think that's insane to think
bite
about.
off each other's eyelashes during sex.
Each other's eyelashes, because here that would be considered, I guess, gruesome and maybe inhumane, but that's so normal in their culture. And I think at the end of the day, that kind of brings us back to the beginning, that sexuality might in fact be constructed, because if you're taught at a young age that is appealing, then obviously you'll grow up and do that yourself.
Yeah, I mean, there are all these questions like, do we just sort of naturally think that everyone likes sex, or do people have to learn to like it or not like it? So the anthropology of Western Ireland has located one particular group as the most sexually repressed group in the world, but that's probably not fair either, because we're putting our value system on them and saying, oh, they're repressed, when they themselves just kind of have this kind of disgust around sex. And there are a lot of people who are celibate, and they also keep their birth rate really low by having these kinds of attitudes too, in a place where you couldn't really support a big population. But people do really feel a lot of disgust around sex in some places. So then we really have to question how much we just really take for granted that we've learned through our culture.
I've always sort of wondered about every little girl that has a baby doll, and every girl that's like pretending to be a mom when they're 3 years old. And it's like, is that something that society has created? All the girls' toys are just baby dolls, so we're all supposed to want to be moms? Or are we coming out of the womb wanting to be a mom? Do you have any sort of...
Yeah, so there's this research that shows that our closest primates, the closest primates to us, they're female babies and human female babies who are more attracted to dolls, and boys are more attracted to like a little red ball, that they could play with. But that is not the whole story, because then our culture and society, because we're not just monkeys, right? Our culture does everything we possibly can to push girls to only want to play with dolls, right? And to push boys to want to do sports. So it wouldn't be really fair to say, oh, it's just all biological and inherent, because we do so much to foment that.
So it's hard to even distinguish what is innate and like what is
learned.
taught.
Yeah,
right.
I think that's really interesting. I think it's cool that you bring up, different animals that we can study, and I'm just wondering, is there any research out there that's particularly interesting when looking at sexuality of different animals, and what can we learn from that?
Why? Why do you care about animal sexuality?
Let him explore his sexuality.
So it turns out animals have a lot more fun having sex than was thought by some scientists just a few decades ago.
That's why Teja's interested.
Are we all just trying to have fun?
Well, one of the things that I like to highlight is just that many animal species have a lot of homosexuality. So there are lesbian
Amen
lizards.
to that, my brothers and sisters.
There are lots and lots of species that engage in what we would think of as gay sex, although, like, for example, sheep. Some researchers have gone so far as to say that sheep boy sheeps are gay, part of gay culture. They have their own gay culture. So much so that, like, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has tried to do something about it, because some of them have such a strong preference, quote unquote, for other boys that they won't mate when the females are in heat. So, to try and produce as many sheep as possible, they try to sort of weed them out. But the sheep live in these very separate societies of the girls over here and the boys over there, and they don't really socialize too much except during mating season.
It's like a middle school dance.
Yeah. Only the boy sheep are probably having a lot more fun than those middle school boys.
Than the middle school boys who
Yeah.
are worried about the girls.
Yeah, right. So they're happier. So there's that, and a lot of this was hidden in plain sight. There was just this. Even some scientists even said, I am not going to study anything queer in the animal kingdom, and they were very homophobic about it. And then there are the primates who are closest to us, the bonobos, the bonobo chimps have a whole lot of sex a whole lot of the time.
Homosexual?
Every kind of sex, homosexual and heterosexual, for lack of better words.
Right.
But and they group sex, and for if you've ever seen like the images in the Kama Sutra, people make jokes that the bonobo look like they've read it. Every kind of configuration. So we have the most in common genetically with the bonobo. So one of the things they do really well is they use sex to solve conflicts between the group members.
Make love, not war.
Yes, that's exactly their kind of philosophy. They also have sex when they're happy or when someone's sad, or
Portia,
to bring the group together. Yeah.
I'm gonna get a text from my dad over here.
Yeah, to all the parents listening, change the channel. So I want to touch on one last thing before we leave. Thank you so much again, Dr. Porter. But in terms of fluidity, do you think there's a potential that people can unlearn what they've learned from a young age? Do you think there's a potential that if people acknowledge...
There's a straight boy you're after, isn't there, Paul?
Oh, no. I'm asexual.
Oh, yeah.
But do you think there's a possibility that people can, in fact, become fluid even after many years of conditioning and constructing their sexualities? What do you guys think?
For women, it's more likely than for men.
Right.
Just from what the research shows so far. Although, perhaps if our society stops being so homophobic and men are allowed to be more full people, maybe we would see more fluidity in men.
So there have to be a societal paradigm change, perhaps, for that type of thing to go down. But
buy Portia's book soon on Amazon and eBay.
One of these days. But interesting to think about. Maybe we'll touch on it next week. We'll do some experiments.
So definitely stay tuned for next week. Thank you so much, Dr. Porter. My name is Paul Schulz.
I'm Portia Baudisch.
And I'm Tej.
And this was Talking Taboo, the newest show on WVUM 90.5. Thank you guys so much for staying tuned. We are here every Monday, 5 to 6. Don't forget to keep it locked.